My best friend Emily and I were accepted into the same university. That summer, she secretly lived with her deadbeat boyfriend for 3 months, but told everyone she was on a graduation trip with me. She stole money from her family to buy him a new phone, claiming it was a graduation gift for me. On the first day of school, she took her tuition money and ran off with her boyfriend, and her family found out. She told them I had manipulated her. What they did to me after that was the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean word for it. It wasn't just violence, though it was that. It was the particular horror of watching a crowd of strangers decide, in real time, that you deserved what was happening to you. Susan came to my classroom. John came with her. They beat me publicly, methodically, with the confidence of people who had already decided the verdict before they arrived. Multiple fractures. Internal bleeding. And when that wasn't enough, when I was already half gone and couldn't have fought back if I'd wanted to, they dragged me to the rooftop and threw me off in front of everyone. I died at 18 years old. The last thing I saw was sky. The last thing I heard was wind. And somewhere in the nothing after, something refused, and I woke up gasping on the morning Emily ran away, staring at a ceiling I recognized, in a body that was whole and unbroken, with the complete memory of everything that was about to happen sitting in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed. I lay there for exactly 4 minutes. I counted. Then I got up, made coffee, and started building the case that would dismantle Emily's family from the inside out before they ever got the chance to touch me again. The first thing I did was buy a voice recorder app and set it to run continuously from 6 in the morning. The second thing I did was screenshot every text Emily had ever sent me, every message where she'd asked me to cover for her, every location she'd asked me to claim she was at, every lie she'd handed me to deliver on her behalf, organized by date, uploaded to a cloud account with a password her parents couldn't guess and her boyfriend couldn't access. The third thing I did was walk to the campus security office before registration and ask very politely whether the gymnasium camera was functional. The officer on duty said yes. I said great, thanked him, and filed that information away. Then I went to registration alone, arrived 9 minutes early, and asked the coordinator, Miss Park, to initial a note confirming my solo arrival time. She looked at me strangely. I said I had a feeling there might be confusion about my whereabouts later. She initialed it. I smiled and went to PE. Susan called at 7:43. My roommate Priya answered because I was lacing my shoes. I let Susan's voice blast through the phone, that particular frequency of a woman who had constructed an entire mythology around her daughter's perfection and needed someone to blame for every crack in it. She accused me of dragging Emily out to play. She told me Emily had been responsible before she met me. She issued her final warning with the confidence of someone who had never once been held accountable for a final warning in her life. I took the phone from Priya, said Emily had mentioned the gym and would call when she was done, and hung up. Then I turned to Priya, who was watching me with the slightly wide eyes of someone who had just realized she was sharing a room with a situation, and I said, if Emily's parents show up today, I need you to remember I came to registration alone. She nodded. I said, I know that's a strange thing to ask. She said, honestly, it doesn't seem that strange. I liked her immediately. I had positioned myself on the grass near the gymnasium wall at the end of our 5-lap run, close enough to the security camera's field of view that anyone interacting with me would be on footage whether they knew it or not. I saw Susan and John crossing the field from 200 meters away, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear exactly, but the particular clarity that comes from knowing what's coming and having already decided how to meet it. In my previous life, I had been blindsided. I had been confused and ashamed and had tried to explain myself to people who had already stopped listening. This time I stood up slowly, turned to face them, and put my hands where the camera could see them clearly, empty still. The posture of someone with nothing to hide and nowhere to run, because running would look like guilt, and guilt was the one thing I categorically did not have. Susan grabbed my hair before she completed her first sentence. The pain was real. I made the sound I would have made anyway because I was not going to perform toughness for an audience that needed to see clearly what was being done to me. I went down when she yanked. John stepped on my chest and the air left my body in a sound that crossed the field. I heard 37 classmates stop moving. I heard someone say, what the hell? I heard phones come out. That specific collective rustle of 20 people reaching for their pockets simultaneously. I heard the PE teacher approaching. I heard John threaten him. I heard John threaten the school. I heard him demand they produce Emily or expel me. And I lay on the ground with his foot on my chest and I thought, every frame of this is being recorded by at least 8 different devices right now. I just need to not give them anything that looks like provocation. I just need to hold on for 60 more seconds. When John's foot finally lifted and Susan's grip loosened enough for me to breathe properly, I looked up at her from the ground and delivered the sentence I had been constructing since 6 in the morning. I said, your daughter eloped this morning with her boyfriend Mike. She has been living with him since June. She used your household account to fund their relationship. She told you she was with me because she knew you would believe her and blame me, and she was right, and I'm sorry you're finding out this way, but I have not seen Emily since yesterday morning, and I have never asked her to lie to you, and I have documentation of every conversation we've had for the past year. Then I said, I'd like to stand up now. Susan's hand opened. The hair came free. I stood. The twist arrived not from Emily's direction, but from Priya's, 6 hours later, when the police officers were still on campus and the statements were still being collected, and I was sitting in the medical office getting my scrapes cleaned. Priya came in, closed the door, sat down across from me, and said she needed to tell me something she'd found while cleaning up her side of the room that morning. She'd knocked over a box from the top shelf, a box she'd assumed was hers, but had turned out to be left behind by the previous occupant of the room, a girl who'd transferred out last spring. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder was a printed email chain. The emails were between John and a university administrator named Dennis Holt, dated 8 months ago before either Emily or I had even submitted our enrollment confirmations. The subject line read, Scholarship verification query. The content was worse than I'd expected, and I'd expected something bad. John had contacted Dennis Holt to raise questions about the legitimacy of my merit scholarship. He had suggested, in the careful language of someone who had done this before, that the application documentation might contain inconsistencies worth reviewing. Dennis Holt had replied that he would look into it. There were 3 follow-up emails. The last one, sent 2 weeks before the start of semester, said the matter was still under review and would be addressed through proper channels. I read the email chain twice. Then I looked at Priya. She said, I don't know what any of this means, but I thought you should have it. I said, it means they weren't planning to just beat me. They were planning to take my scholarship. They were planning to get me expelled. The violence on the field was the backup plan. She stared at me. I said, how long have you been my roommate? She said, 9 hours. I said, I'm sorry, this is your Tuesday. She said, honestly, I've had worse. I photographed every page of the email chain and sent the images to the same cloud account as everything else. Then I asked the police officer handling my assault report whether she could note that I had additional documentation relevant to a potential fraud investigation. She told me to come to the station tomorrow and bring everything. I said I would. I thanked the medical office nurse, put my jacket on over my bandaged arm, and walked back to the dorm in the early evening light with the particular feeling of someone who has just discovered that the situation is significantly larger than it appeared, but who has also discovered that they are significantly more prepared than the people who built it ever anticipated. That night, after Priya fell asleep, I lay in the dark and thought about Emily, not with anger. That had burned itself out somewhere between the rooftop and the waking, had left behind something cooler and more useful. I thought about the Emily I had known before I understood what she was, the one who had laughed too loud at bad movies and shared her fries without being asked, and had once sat with me for 4 hours on a bus bench when I missed my stop because she hadn't wanted me to wait alone. That Emily was real. The Emily who had handed me to her parents like a sacrifice was also real. People contained both, and that was the thing no one told you. That the person who hurt you most could also be the person who once made you feel most seen, and both things could be true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out. I was not going to forgive Emily, but I was going to understand her, which was different, and in some ways harder. I fell asleep thinking about Dennis Holt's email and the phrase, proper channels, and what it meant that someone inside the university had been willing to be part of this. That was the part that hadn't fully landed yet. That was the part that was going to matter most in part 2. I didn't know it yet, but I was starting to feel the shape of it. The morning after the assault, I walked into the campus police liaison office at 8 a.m. with a folder that was 3 centimeters thick and a cloud account with 47 uploaded files, and I sat across from Officer Reyes and put everything on the table in chronological order. The voice memo, the text screenshots, the registration timestamp initialed by Miss Park, Priya's folder with the John to Dennis email chain, the security camera footage request I'd already submitted in writing before leaving campus the night before. Officer Reyes was a woman who had clearly seen a lot of things in her career and had developed the professional expression of someone who could receive information without visibly reacting to it, but halfway through the email chain she stopped and read a section twice. I watched her do it. She looked up and said, "How did you know to document all of this before any of it happened?" I said I had a feeling it was going to be a complicated day. She looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she said, "Okay. Let's go through it from the beginning." The assault charges processed cleanly because the footage was unambiguous. 6 student phone videos. The gymnasium security camera. 37 witness statements of varying quality but consistent in their core facts. John's attorney attempted the parental distress argument within 48 hours, which was either brave or delusional, and the judge dismissed it in approximately 90 seconds. Susan's attorney took a different approach and advised cooperation, which was smarter, and Susan began cooperating within the week. What she cooperated about was not what I had expected. The Park Education Foundation, which I learned about from the scholarship office audit 3 weeks into the semester, had been Susan's creation. She'd built it 4 years ago quietly, using her maiden name and a P.O. box and the kind of meticulous organizational attention that, directed differently, could have built something genuinely useful. Its purpose, as she eventually explained in a deposition I received transcripts of, had been a contingency, a removal mechanism. Something she could activate if Emily ever chose me over the family. If our friendship ever became, in Susan's assessment, a threat to Emily's future. She had never intended it to be used the way John had used it. She had built a fire extinguisher and John had converted it into an accelerant, and the distinction between those two intentions had apparently never come up in their marriage, until the moment a police officer put the email chain in front of her and asked her to explain the P.O. box. Here was the first twist I hadn't seen coming, even with a whole previous life behind me. Susan hadn't known about John's contact with Dennis Holt. She found out in the same room as the investigators. I watched the transcript of that moment carefully. The pause, 3 seconds long before she responded. The way her answer shifted register from cooperative to something more fragile. John had taken her contingency plan and weaponized it without telling her. Had made contact with a university administrator 8 months before we'd even enrolled. Had been building a parallel architecture of removal that Susan had known nothing about. Which meant John had been planning this independently. Which meant the question of what John actually wanted, separate from Emily, separate from the family narrative, suddenly became very relevant and very dark. Dennis Holt resigned from his administrative position 11 days after the investigation expanded to include him. His resignation letter cited personal reasons, which was technically true in the way that being caught is a personal experience. His email responses to John had been careful, plausibly deniable, phrased as procedural inquiry rather than conspiracy, but the investigators found 3 other email chains in his university account, 3 other families, 3 other scholarship students, 3 other sets of quietly raised questions that had never escalated to formal proceedings, but had created enough administrative friction to cause 2 of the 3 students to transfer out in their first year. John was not the first parent who had come to Dennis Holt with this kind of request. He was simply the first one whose plan had also involved assault footage from 6 different camera angles. I sat in my dorm room the evening I received that information and felt something shift in the architecture of my understanding of what had happened to me. I had always known in both lives that I had been targeted. What I hadn't understood was the scale. This wasn't just Emily's family being Emily's family. This was a system, small, informal, operating in the gaps between institutional oversight, that had been quietly removing students who someone with money or connections or the right kind of persistent complaint had decided shouldn't be there. I was not the first. I was just the first one who had come in with documentation already prepared and a voice memo running. I forwarded the information to Officer Reyes, and then I forwarded it to the university's external legal counsel, and then I forwarded it to a journalist at the student newspaper named Cho Min-seo, who had been covering the assault story from the first day, and who had the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for a thread like this to pull. She published the full investigation 2 weeks later. It ran 6,000 words. It named Dennis Holt by name, and described the pattern across all 3 prior cases. The 2 students who had transferred out were contacted. One agreed to speak on record. The university president issued a formal statement that was mostly apology and partly defensive and entirely insufficient, but the external audit it triggered was neither. And 3 additional administrative irregularities emerged from it that had nothing to do with me but everything to do with the specific culture Dennis Holt had been operating in, unchecked, for 7 years. Emily came back to campus in the 2nd month. Mike had folded faster than either of them had expected. The marriage license filing had been withdrawn. The apartment lease had 3 weeks left on it and no one to pay it. Emily returned with 1 suitcase and a cousin's loan and the expression of someone who has run very fast in a very specific direction and arrived somewhere they didn't intend. She enrolled in a different program. She moved into graduate housing. She called me once. I answered, which surprised both of us. She said she'd seen the newspaper story. She said she hadn't known about her father's emails to Dennis Holt. I said I believed her. She said she'd found out about the foundation, the Park Education Foundation, her mother's contingency, the thing built in her name to remove the person who had been her only friend. Her voice when she said that was the quietest I had ever heard her. She said, my mom built a weapon with my name on it and aimed it at you and told herself it was protection. I said yes. She said, I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. She said, I'm sorry for the things I did know about. I said, I know. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, are you okay? I said, getting there. She said, me too. We hung up and I sat with the weight of that conversation for a long time. The way you sit with something that has been resolved but not healed, which are different things, and the difference matters. The second twist, the one that came completely without warning and rewrote something I thought I understood, arrived in the form of a phone call in the 3rd month of the semester from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I was in the habit of answering unknown numbers now, having learned that information sometimes arrived without announcing itself. The voice on the other end was a woman who identified herself as a lawyer representing a client who wished to remain anonymous. She said her client had become aware of the Holt investigation through the student newspaper and had information relevant to my scholarship that she believed I should have. I said I was listening. She said her client was one of the 3 prior students Holt had targeted, the one who had not spoken on record to Minseo. She said her client had kept documentation. She said the documentation included something the student newspaper story hadn't covered because Minseo hadn't known to ask. Dennis Holt had not been operating alone. He had a contact outside the university, someone who had been referring these cases to him, someone who had identified students worth targeting and passed their names and scholarship details along. The referral source, she said, was not John. John had found Holt independently, through a different channel. The referral source for the other 3 cases was the same person every time. She said the name. I sat down on the edge of my bed without planning to. The name was Aunt Penny, Susan's sister. Emily's aunt, who had attended every family dinner I had ever been to, who had slipped me $20 for my birthday every year since I was 9, who had always been in the peripheral warmth of Emily's family, the uncomplicated one. Penny, who worked in university admissions consulting. Penny, who had spent 7 years advising families on how to navigate scholarship processes, and who had apparently developed a secondary practice advising a different kind of family, the kind who wanted a scholarship student removed rather than admitted. She had been passing names to Dennis Holt for 7 years. She had not passed mine. That had been John, independent of her. But the system that John had found and used had been built by someone who had held my face in her hands at every Christmas and told my mother what a wonderful girl I was becoming. I don't have a clean way to describe what I felt when I received that information. It wasn't anger, though, it was that too. It was something closer to the specific grief of a world becoming smaller. The realization that the warmth you thought you'd been surrounded by had always had a different temperature just below the surface, and you'd simply been standing too close to feel the cold. I sat on my bed for a long time. Then I called Officer Reyes. She picked up on the second ring. I said, I have a new name for you. She said, of course you do. She said it like someone who had stopped being surprised and had arrived somewhere past it, which was approximately where I was too. Penny's case was slower and more complicated than Holt's because her connection to the other 3 students was circumstantial until it wasn't. And the moment it became was when the anonymous client agreed to speak on record after all. Which she hadn't been willing to do until she found out she wasn't the only one. Until the newspaper story showed her that the things she'd survived hadn't been personal bad luck, but a pattern. And patterns are survivable in a way that personal targeting isn't, because patterns mean you weren't chosen for something wrong with you. You were chosen for something right. A scholarship, an academic record, a place someone else had decided you didn't deserve. She spoke on record. Then the second prior student, the one who had already spoken, gave an additional statement about a consultation with an admissions advisor she now remembered. The advisor's business card, photographed and uploaded to her email 7 years ago, because she'd been the kind of careful, organized student who photographed everything, had Penny's name on it. The investigation concluded in the spring. Holt faced professional censure and a civil suit from 2 of the 3 prior students. Penny's consulting license was suspended pending a board review that everyone expected to result in revocation. John's suspended sentence became a served one. Susan completed her community service and lived, I was told through the slow drift of mutual information, with a clarity about her marriage and her sister that she had not previously had access to, which was either going to rebuild her or finish what the investigation had started, and either way was something she was going to have to navigate without me. The scholarship was confirmed in writing in April, with a formal apology from the university president attached, which I framed and put next to my chemistry exam, which was a B+, because both of them had cost me something, and both of them were mine. Priya and I applied to share the same room in the second year, and she was accepted, and we celebrated with takeout on the floor of the room we'd lived in since a Tuesday that had tried to end everything and had instead started something that turned out to be the most important education of my first year. Not chemistry, not the coursework, but the hard specific knowledge of how to build a case, how to document a truth, how to stay standing in the center of a storm that someone else manufactured, how to make sure that when the record was finally read, it said exactly what had actually happened. I walked across campus on the last evening of the semester as the light went long and gold across the buildings, and I thought about the rooftop and the life I had already lived, and I thought about the fall and the nothing and the waking, and I thought about all the distance between that ending and this one. The distance was made of timestamps and cloud uploads and a security camera and a roommate who answered a phone on a morning she had no reason to, and a journalist who pulled a thread until it unraveled something 7 years old, and a woman in another city who had photographed a business card because she was the kind of person who photographed everything, the kind of careful, thorough person that the Holts and the Johns of the world had counted on not existing, and had been wrong about repeatedly across years. I was still here. I would be here tomorrow. I chose it, like I chose it every morning, not because the choosing was easy but because I had already seen the alternative and found it unacceptable. The campus was green and loud with the end of semester, and I walked through it like I belonged there. Which I did, which I had always done, which no amount of planning or foundation or administrator or aunt with a consulting practice had ultimately been able to change. I was still here, that was everything. That was, in the end, more than enough.